Following the defeat of their shared enemy, the United States, the UK, and the Soviet Union sat down to figure out what came next. With the Axis powers gone, a power vacuum opened up in Europe. The continent fractured into two hostile ideological camps, capitalist democracies on one side and communist regimes on the other. The United States adopted the Truman Doctrine, a policy to contain the spread of communism anywhere on the globe. In response, the Soviet Union tightened its grip over Eastern Europe, dropping an iron curtain across the continent. The introduction of the atomic bomb shifted the landscape. Geopolitical rivalry became a threat of extinction. A terrifying logic took hold once the Soviets built their own arsenal: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. If either superpower fired a nuclear missile, the other would detect it and fire back, guaranteeing annihilation for both sides. Since direct warfare guaranteed extinction, Washington and Moscow reached a stalemate. Fighting for global supremacy now required a new playbook of indirect, non-lethal maneuvers. Berlin became the first testing ground for this new conflict. The city was divided between the Allies, but its location deep within Soviet-controlled territory made it vulnerable. Joseph Stalin cut off all supply routes to the Western-controlled sectors, hoping to starve the city into submission. The Western Allies responded by flying hundreds of thousands of supply planes directly over the blockade for nearly a year. When the blockade failed, the Soviets faced a brain drain as citizens fled to the capitalist West. To stop the exodus, the East German government physically walled off their side of the city with concrete and barbed wire. Tensions peaked at Checkpoint Charlie, where US and Soviet tanks rolled up to the boundary. They sat face to face in a 16-hour standoff, while the world waited for a spark. The tanks eventually withdrew. Positioning rival militaries inches apart, risking the nuclear exchange both sides were desperate to prevent. The strategy shifted to brinksmanship, pushing a dangerous situation to the absolute limit to call an opponent's nuclear bluff. In October 1962, a U.S. spy plane flying over Cuba discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly positioning nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles from the American coast. Surveillance imagery of missile trailers and director equipment provided undeniable evidence to American leadership, forcing an immediate, aggressive response. The U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba, intercepting Soviet ships. As communications failed, the U.S. military moved to Defcon 2, the final step before a nuclear strike. At the height of the panic, a Soviet submarine commander nearly fired a nuclear torpedo after losing contact with Moscow. Disaster was avoided through last-second negotiations, proving that direct nuclear intimidation was a suicidal strategy. Realizing direct confrontation was impossible, the superpowers began fighting through third-party nations. By arming and funding local factions, they could bleed an opponent's resources without officially declaring war. This was driven by the domino effect, the fear in Washington that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would sequentially topple. In Korea, both superpowers armed opposing local factions, turning a civil war into an international bloodbath that ended in a permanent stalemate. In Vietnam, the United States transitioned from an advisory role into a prolonged jungle war, drafting millions to fight an elusive enemy in the thick canopy. The Soviets faced their own decade-long quagmire when they invaded Afghanistan, battling a US-sponsored insurgency in the Rocky Mountain passes. While the centers of power remained at peace, these proxy wars caused millions of casualties across the developing world. Sustaining a multi-decade global arms race and a network of proxy wars carried an enormous economic toll. In the 1980s, America shifted its strategy to outspend the Soviets. President Ronald Reagan authorized massive defense budgets, including high-tech satellite weaponry. The American economy generated enough wealth to absorb these costs. In the Soviet Union, the system began to buckle. Citizens faced daily shortages of basic goods, waiting in long lines for bread and shoes. The Soviet collapse was financial. By the late 1980s, the state could no longer fund the cost of its own empire. Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to save the economy through political transparency and openness, allowing citizens to publicly criticize the government for the first time in decades. But the pressure of repressed dissent was too high. Granting small freedoms triggered an uncontrollable wave of revolution that overwhelmed the state. Across the Eastern Bloc, citizens demanded elections. In November 1989, the movement reached a climax as Germans swarmed the border and began tearing down the Berlin Wall. A domestic democratic movement led by Boris Yeltsin stripped the Communist Party of its authority, officially dissolving the Soviet Union. For decades, the world feared instant atomic annihilation, yet the Cold War concluded when one system simply ran out of money to exist.